was September 1997, and the streets of Los Angeles buzzed with the usual chaos, but in a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city, a plan was taking shape that would make history. A group of criminals, highly organized and ruthless, was preparing for what would become one of the largest cash heists in U.S. history. They were not your typical street criminals. This group was smart, patient, and methodical. What made them even more dangerous was that one of them had intimate knowledge of the Dunbar Armored Company, the very target of their heist. The mastermind behind the operation was a man named James Black, who had worked his way up within Dunbar Armored as a regional safety inspector. It was an ideal position for someone with malicious intent. Black had access to critical details about the company's security systems, the cash delivery schedules, and the internal processes used to safeguard millions of dollars. Over time, he became intimately familiar with the routines of the employees, including the armored truck drivers and the vault personnel. With this insider knowledge, he realized that the company's security, while sophisticated on the surface, had several weaknesses that could be exploited with the right planning. For months, Black had been quietly gathering information and recruiting a team. The crew was a mix of experienced criminals, each chosen for their unique skills. There was Tony, an expert in electronics and security systems, Ricky, a former getaway driver with a knack for planning escape routes, and Marcus, a smooth-talking con man who could blend into any crowd. Together they formed the core of the heist, but it was Black's deep understanding of Dunbar Armored's operations that made their plan so formidable. The strategy was simple in theory. They would wait for the perfect moment when the facility was brimming with cash, just after the regular cash drop from the armored trucks. The vault inside the facility contained $18.9 million, an amount too large to ignore. But getting to the money would require careful coordination. The facility had tight security, including surveillance cameras, motion detectors, and a team of guards, but Black knew exactly when and how to bypass these measures. The first step in the plan was to disable the security systems at just the right time. With his knowledge of Dunbar Armored's security protocols, Black was able to figure out the exact time the cameras would loop, creating a small window where no one would be able to see what was happening. He also knew that the security alarm system could be temporarily deactivated with a few well-placed adjustments. This would give them a limited window to access the vault undetected. Once inside, the crew would use their experience to quickly locate the money and move it out of the facility. The vault's design was complex, but Black had observed the process many times and knew exactly how to bypass the security measures and crack the code. The plan was for the crew to empty the vault in less than 30 minutes, after which they would be gone without a trace. What truly made this plan dangerous was its precision. Every detail had been accounted for, every contingency planned. They would leave no evidence behind. The crew would vanish into the night, disappearing into the sprawling city of Los Angeles, where they could blend in and enjoy their ill-gotten gains. It seemed foolproof. Black had spent months preparing, meticulously covering every angle and ensuring that no one would be able to trace the crime back to them. For a brief moment, it seemed like nothing could go wrong. The perfect plan was in place. As the evening of September 12th arrived, the temperature in Los Angeles dropped, and the bustling city began to quiet down, unaware that a massive heist was about to unfold just miles away. The criminals had prepared for this night for months, and as the hours ticked closer to their target, adrenaline surged through their veins. Each member of the crew knew their role, and the plan was set into motion. The first phase of the operation hinged on the inside man, James Black. As the regional safety inspector, Black had a level of trust and authority that made him nearly invisible to his colleagues. It was his knowledge of the security system that made the next steps possible. Just as the last armored truck delivered its load of cash to the Dunbar Armored facility, Black used his insider access to temporarily disable the security cameras, creating a small window of opportunity. He knew that for about 10 minutes the surveillance system would be in a loop, repeating a previous recording. That was the moment the crew had been waiting for. The crew moved swiftly, parking their getaway vehicle several blocks away in an inconspicuous alley. They approached the facility with careful precision, blending into the shadows, taking advantage of the dim lighting around the building. Black, knowing the layout of the facility like the back of his hand, led them to the side entrance that had a minimal security presence. Using a key card he had secretly obtained, Black unlocked the door, and the crew stepped into the darkness of the building. Inside, the tension was palpable. Tony, the electronics expert, immediately set to work. He had already prepared a small device that would disable the facility's motion detectors. With his hands steady, Tony connected the device to the system's control panel, rendering the alarm system temporarily inactive. With the security systems neutralized, they could now focus on their real objective, the vault. As the crew made their way through the narrow hallways, their footsteps echoed softly against the concrete floor. Every step was calculated, each movement deliberate. The vault was located at the heart of the facility, behind a thick, reinforced door that seemed impossible to crack. But for Black, it was no obstacle. He knew the combination to the vault door, having observed it countless times during his work as a safety inspector. With the final security measure deactivated, he turned the code lock and the door clicked open. Inside, stacks of cash awaited them, $18.9 million in bills, neatly organized and ready to be transported. The sight of so much money sent a thrill through the group, but they kept their focus. They quickly began loading the cash into duffel bags, using every available inch of space. It wasn't just the money that was valuable, it was the timing. They had to move fast. Within 20 minutes, the entire vault was emptied. The crew had executed their part of the plan with military precision, leaving no trace of their presence behind. As the last duffel bag was filled, the crew took one final sweep of the room to ensure they hadn't overlooked anything. Satisfied that they had taken everything, they made their way back to the exit. The getaway vehicle was waiting, and the moment they stepped outside, the adrenaline hit. There was no turning back now. As they loaded the bags of cash into the trunk, Ricky, the getaway driver, was already behind the wheel, the engine purring with anticipation. The crew piled into the car, and with one last look at the facility, they sped off into the night. The plan had worked flawlessly. The perfect heist had been executed, and for the moment they were untouchable. As they vanished into the sprawling city, they felt a brief sense of triumph. No one had seen them, no alarms had sounded. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though they had pulled off the perfect crime, until the consequences began to unfold. The Dunbar Armored Heist left law enforcement and the public in a state of disbelief. A crime so clean, so expertly executed, seemed almost too good to be true. The thieves had managed to evade detection at every turn. No forced entry, no alarm triggers, no witnesses. It was as though the money had simply vanished into thin air. The Los Angeles police were left scrambling to piece together the few clues they had, but the absence of evidence made their task almost impossible. Detectives from multiple agencies joined forces in an attempt to track down the perpetrators, but the trail was eerily cold. The vault had been emptied in a matter of minutes, the criminals leaving behind no fingerprints, no physical evidence, and no direct leads. The security footage from the facility had been manipulated, and when investigators reviewed the tapes, they saw nothing but hours of blank, repetitive footage. It was as if the entire event had been staged in such a way that it would be almost impossible to trace. The most obvious clue was the insider knowledge. Dunbar Armored's reputation for security was well known, and for such an elaborate heist to succeed, someone on the inside had to be involved. The investigators focused their attention on the staff, poring over employee records and surveillance footage from the days leading up to the heist. But as weeks passed, no one stood out. The workers seemed trustworthy, and no one had any apparent motive for being involved in such a massive crime. Months passed, and the investigation continued to stall. The authorities followed numerous dead ends, chasing every lead that came their way, from small-time criminals trying to launder cash to tip-offs from anonymous sources. But nothing seemed to connect. At times, it felt as though the case was growing colder by the day. Dunbar Armored, meanwhile, was under intense pressure to resolve the situation. Climbing out of the cab in a thread to escape, Dunbar Armored, meanwhile, their reputation had been severely damaged, and the public was growing impatient. Then, in an unexpected twist, a breakthrough came. Small amounts of the stolen cash began showing up in local businesses, a luxury car dealership, a jewelry store, and even high-end restaurants started receiving large amounts of cash from customers who were spending lavishly without a care in the world. The authorities, alert to any unusual behavior, began tracking the serial numbers on the bills. It didn't take long before they made a crucial connection. Some of the cash had passed through the hands of one of the heist participants. It wasn't a direct lead, but it was enough to start piecing things together. Law enforcement began to trace the money back to one of the thieves, a man named Darren. Darren was known for his brash attitude and reckless spending. When investigators dug deeper, they found a trail of purchases and lifestyle choices that suggested he wasn't living within his means. He had bought expensive cars, high-end clothing, and lavish gifts, all paid for in cash. This was the break they had been waiting for. Under heavy surveillance, the authorities began to close in on Darren. They brought him in for questioning, but the process was slow. At first, Darren was tight-lipped, refusing to cooperate, but as the pressure mounted, cracks began to show. He couldn't maintain the lie any longer, and soon he cracked under the weight of the investigation. Darren admitted to being part of the heist, but claimed that he wasn't the mastermind. Reluctantly, he agreed to lead the authorities to the others. The team of criminals slowly began to unravel as Darren pointed them toward the other members of the crew. One by one, they were arrested, each more surprised than the last at how quickly their plans had been exposed. But the most shocking discovery came when they uncovered the identity of the inside man. It was James Black, the regional safety inspector at Dunbar Armored. His position had given him complete access to the facility's security systems, and it had been his insider knowledge that had made the heist so successful. Black had carefully planned every detail, coordinating with the crew to ensure that nothing went wrong. He had spent months preparing for the perfect heist, and for a while, it seemed like he would get away with it. But in the end, the law caught up with him, and the elaborate plan came crashing down. Black was arrested along with the rest of the crew, and the stolen money was recovered, though much of it had already been spent. The investigation was a testament to the persistence of law enforcement, and although the thieves had pulled off a near-perfect crime, they had underestimated one thing: the determination of those chasing them. The investigation had proven that no matter how well planned a crime may be, eventually the truth always finds its way to the surface. Just when it seemed like the investigation into the Dunbar Armored Heist had reached a dead end, a crucial lead emerged, breathing new life into the case. For months, the authorities had been following a series of small, inconspicuous leads that amounted to little. But as the stolen money began circulating through the hands of local businesses, the case took a sharp turn. Detectives working the case noticed an unusual trend. Large sums of cash were being spent in places where they had no right to be. The money was being used in luxury shops, car dealerships, and high-end restaurants, and some of the bills traced back to the heist were showing up in these establishments. At first, the connection was faint, just a few unremarkable purchases made by customers who seemed to be flaunting their newfound wealth. But the authorities were meticulous, and after tracing the serial numbers of the bills, they found that the money was part of the loot taken from the Dunbar Armored Vault. Slowly, they pieced together a pattern that pointed to one of the thieves, Darren. He had been spending recklessly and without any apparent concern for where the money had come from. High-end watches, expensive cars, and lavish nights out, all paid for with stacks of cash that hadn't even been laundered properly. Darren's overspending was the thread that began to unravel the entire operation. The authorities knew they had found a weakness, and they quickly zeroed in on him. They placed him under surveillance, watching his every move, but it wasn't long before they decided to bring him in for questioning. At first, Darren was uncooperative, refusing to admit his involvement in the heist. He maintained a facade of innocence, pretending as though his newfound fortune had come from some unknown source. But the pressure was mounting, and Darren's defenses slowly crumbled. When the detectives finally broke through, Darren admitted to being part of the heist. He reluctantly confessed to his role, but claimed that he was just one small piece in a much larger operation. As part of his plea deal, Darren agreed to cooperate and provide the names of the other individuals involved. His cooperation was the breakthrough the investigation needed. Darren's testimony led the authorities directly to the other members of the crew, each of whom had been hiding in plain sight. As the criminals were rounded up, one by one, the investigation began to take shape. But the real twist came when it was revealed that the inside man, the one who had been feeding the criminals with crucial information about the vault's security and the schedules of the armored trucks, was none other than James Black, the regional safety inspector for Dunbar Armored. The revelation shocked everyone involved. Black had been a trusted employee, someone who had worked his way up in the company and had been in a position of authority for years. His knowledge of the company's operations had made him the perfect insider. Black knew every aspect of the facility's security system, every weakness and every blind spot. He had carefully orchestrated the heist, using his position to disable the security cameras and deactivate the alarm system at precisely the right moments. What made his involvement even more surprising was the fact that he had been under the radar for so long. Despite being so close to the heart of the operation, he had managed to cover his tracks, making it seem as though the crime was a work of pure genius. The authorities were stunned at how well Black had pulled off the deception. He had maintained his cover throughout the entire investigation, and even though suspicions were high that there was an inside man, no one had ever suspected him. His betrayal was not just a betrayal of his employer, it was a betrayal of the entire system. Black had used the trust placed in him to orchestrate a crime of unimaginable scale. As the investigation came to a close and the criminals were arrested, Black's role as the mastermind became clearer. He had carefully planned every aspect of the heist, ensuring that nothing went wrong, and for a while it seemed as though the perfect crime might go unsolved. But the twist of Darren's reckless spending had cracked the case wide open. In the end, the law caught up with the criminals, and the money, though mostly spent, was recovered. The heist that had once seemed like an impossible crime now stood as a testament to both the brilliance and the ultimate failure of those who thought they could outsmart the system. The aftermath of the Dunbar Armored Heist reverberated through both the criminal world and the public. While the investigation had ultimately led to the arrest of the crew responsible for the crime, the shock of how the heist unfolded left a lasting mark on law enforcement and the security industry. The scale of the theft, $18.9 million, was staggering, but what was truly remarkable was the flawless execution of the plan. For a while, it had seemed like the criminals would get away with it. The precision of their operation made it almost impossible to believe that they had been caught. James Black, the inside man, had pulled off one of the most successful betrayals in recent memory. His position within Dunbar Armored gave him access to critical information that allowed him to manipulate the system from the inside out. As a regional safety inspector, he had studied the security protocols, identified weaknesses, and exploited them with cold, calculated precision. It was his deep understanding of the company's operations that had allowed the heist to unfold without a hitch. No one had suspected him, and for months he continued to live his life, completely undisturbed by the investigation. But when Darren's reckless spending began to surface, the authorities were able to break through the carefully constructed facade. Darren's overspending was the crack that allowed investigators to trace the stolen money, eventually leading them to the other members of the crew. The twist revealing Black's role as the mastermind sent shockwaves through both the public and those within Dunbar Armored. His betrayal of the company was not just about money. It was a betrayal of trust on an unprecedented scale. He had been the trusted gatekeeper of the company's security, and in the end he had used that trust to orchestrate one of the largest cash heists in U.S. history. Chad Kelly. For the criminals, the aftermath was just as devastating. Though they had managed to evade capture for months, the final reckoning came swiftly. One by one they were arrested and their ill-gotten wealth began to unravel. Much of the stolen money had already been spent. Lavish cars, designer clothes, expensive jewelry. But as the authorities dug deeper, they discovered that the criminals had been hiding large sums in various locations, attempting to launder the rest of the cash through multiple channels. Some of the money had made its way into the hands of petty criminals, while others had been used for extravagant purchases, which ultimately led to their undoing. The court trials that followed were lengthy and highly publicized. The crew, including Black, faced serious charges, ranging from conspiracy to theft to money laundering. Though Black was the mastermind, each member of the gang had played a role, and they all faced significant jail sentences. Darren, the man who had led authorities to the others, received a reduced sentence for his cooperation, but it was little consolation for the years of his life that were now lost to prison. The rest of the crew, however, faced the full force of the law. For Dunbar Armour, the damage was substantial. The company had prided itself on its security measures, but the heist exposed vulnerabilities that no one had anticipated. Trust in the company eroded, and many clients began to question whether their money was safe with such a breach of security. The company implemented sweeping changes to their operations, tightening security protocols and overhauling their internal procedures. They also worked to rebuild their reputation, though it would take years for the public to fully regain confidence in their ability to protect assets. The case left law enforcement with lingering questions. How had such a sophisticated crime gone unnoticed for so long? How had they missed the subtle signs that pointed to an insider's involvement? While the authorities were able to piece together the puzzle in the end, the case served as a wake-up call to both the security industry and law enforcement agencies everywhere. No matter how perfect a crime may seem, there is always a flaw. and someone will eventually make a mistake. For the criminals, that mistake was Darren's careless spending, and for Black, it was underestimating the persistence of the investigators. In the end, the Dunbar Armored Heist became a cautionary tale, one of brilliant planning, shocking betrayal, and the eventual collapse of a criminal empire built on deception. The money was mostly recovered, but the damage to the individuals involved and the company was immeasurable. The heist would go down in history as one of the most daring and expertly executed crimes, but it also demonstrated the inevitable consequences of greed and the lengths people will go to when they think they can escape justice. The end of the Dunbar Armored Heist saga was marked by a series of sobering realizations for everyone involved. James Black, the mastermind, was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison, a punishment that seemed fitting given the scope of his crime. The once trusted safety inspector's life had unraveled completely. His carefully constructed web of lies and deceit had fallen apart, leaving him with nothing but the weight of his actions. As he entered prison, it became clear that his reputation would never recover. Black was remembered not for his years of service, but for his betrayal of the very company he had sworn to protect. For the rest of the crew, the consequences were similarly severe. Darren, who had initially tried to cover up his role in the heist, cooperated with the authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. But even with the deal, he faced more than 15 years in prison. His reckless spending and the subsequent traceability of the stolen money had sealed his fate. While his cooperation had helped law enforcement close the case, the toll on his life was undeniable. The other members of the crew, including Tony, Ricky, and Marcus, faced the full force of the law. Their punishments ranged from 20 to 25 years depending on their involvement. None of them had expected such a well-executed plan to end so abruptly, but their greed had led them to underestimate the relentless pursuit of justice. Their lives, once filled with promises of luxury and escape, were now reduced to years behind bars. For Dunbar Armor, the damage was far-reaching. The heist had exposed vulnerabilities that no one had ever imagined could exist within their operations. While they had recovered most of the stolen money, the breach of trust had been far more costly. Clients and employees alike were shaken by the realization that an insider could exploit such a massive loophole in the system. The company had to work tirelessly to rebuild its reputation, but it was an uphill battle. Though their security protocols were tightened and their internal processes revamped, the stain of the heist would never fully wash away. The Dunbar Armored Heist remained one of the most daring and well-executed crimes in history. The criminal crew had come close to pulling off the perfect crime, but in the end, their hubris and carelessness led to their downfall. The stolen money had largely been spent, but the investigation proved that even the most sophisticated plans couldn't outrun the law forever. And for Black and his crew, the end of their criminal careers marked the beginning of a long stretch behind bars, living with the consequences of their actions for the rest of their lives.